Hello and welcome to We Are the Deluge, a spoiler-free chapter-by-chapter podcast about the climate change novel The Deluge by Stephen Markley. We are your co-hosts, Emily Crandall and John McMahon, the unexplained text boxes of your mind. Today, we are discussing Shane and Murdock at breakfast, set in 2014, the first chapter from Shane's point of view. We are presenting Emily in the form of a political manifesto.
Good thing we know exactly what that looks like. Although I will say it was harder to adapt my thoughts on that structure than I anticipated, but you know what? A good challenge.
Yeah, I think we're going to be able to do it.
Okay, I had two other proposals for how to introduce us. Do you mind if I?
Yes. Oh, I would love to hear this.
One's like just borderline, maybe not so politically correct, and the other one is really yikes. Okay, so I thought about Emily Crandall and John McMahon, a couple of cerebral hicks. And then also the Emily Crandall and John McMahon, the not so, because we are not recently juiced. Which is a term used throughout this chapter for blown up.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Both of those I would have accepted fully without question.
But unexplained text boxes of your mind is very good.
And that's going meta on the podcast form, I guess.
Yeah. And it will become clear, dear listener, exactly what that means soon, unless you've already read it and then you know and you're in on the joke.
Yes.
Okay, so should we say a bit about Political Manifesto as our choice for these chapters, or how we're gonna flow through it? What do we think?
Yeah, I mean, this is another genre that is near and dear to our hearts, as we both teach political manifestos all the time. What is your favorite political manifesto to teach?
Ooh, that's a good question. I like to teach, oh my gosh, the Radical Lesbians. Woman Identified Woman is one of my favorites.
Love that one.
I don't know if everyone would agree that it is a manifesto. I think some people would sort of undermine its form and force and call it a pamphlet or something, but I teach it as a manifesto.
Yeah. I do a day in feminist political thought with that, and one of my favorite manifestos is Red Stockings Manifesto.
Yes,
and I put those two together.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
I'm right.
So I'm with you. I think probably my favorite to teach, because I do it in almost every class, is Common River Collective Statement, which too would argue is a manifesto.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess in that sense, our structure sort of maybe unconsciously or perhaps consciously from your perspective borrows from that. So we're going to sort of adapt the way we're discussing the book more broadly to the loose components that make up a manifesto. So the declaration is going to be our summary.
Yes.
This is what's happening, right? Here's the political stakes. We're going to go from there to a sort of diagnosis of the current problem, which is where we'll go into our kind of reactions, discussion of the themes, kind of stick with the chapter. And then we'll sort of zoom out to what have others gotten right or wrong about this, right? So this is where Marx takes up political economy, for example. Mm-hmm. And there we'll do our theory and our cultural artifacts and our sort of millennial comedy section, which we're folding into a sort of rhetoric thread that we both see in a lot of manifestos, which is that there are often sort of sarcastic digs at opponents. So we're going to adapt that portion of a manifesto to our running commentary on sort of like what's funny about this book. Yeah. Although I would argue in this chapter that although there is a lot that is funny, it is very dark.
It is one of the darker humors of the novel, for sure.
Yeah, and then from there we'll talk about solidarity, allies, and enemies, which is where we'll do our sort of character mapping. And this, I think, actually weirdly works for this chapter kind of at the end, given just the nature of this chapter more broadly. Yeah. And then when in doing our sort of alternate episode titles, we'll attempt to parody the title of the chapter in a political slogan call to action. So we have both warned the other that this was the hardest part. So we'll see.
Absolutely.
We'll see what comes out of it at the
end. I can't wait. So let's dive in with the declaration. What is your one sentence declaration / summary for this week, Emily?
Okay. I'm not sure it quite works as a declaration, but it's more like a teaser, I think.
Yes.
Because I wanted to also also have it have a little bit of plot, but it's also teasing some of the things that I have to say about the diagnosis of the current condition and what others have gotten wrong. So we'll see if it works. Okay, I wrote Shane and Murdock grapple with their standpoints on war. Use standpoint intentionally. And brace for a different new war.
Okay, we're in the same zone. Although you follow the declaration more closely, I went with the mysterious activist / radical Shane recruits her one-time comrade Murdock, an Iraq War veteran and explosives expert whose inner life we have eerie access to for an unknown, cryptic one more war.
Oh, very good. Okay, yeah, we were right in the same had the same idea there.
Yeah, and if we're both seeding also our episode titles, I think we're going to be in the same space there too.
Perfect. I appreciate that you add clauses to your one sentence that actually explain who these people are. I think that's a very useful point. Do you want to maybe do that first part slower, just as a following along with who exactly they are before we jump in?
Yes, sure. I mean, this is an interesting chapter to introduce Shane through because, as you pointed out when we were chatting before we started recording, Shane is, one of the 6 POVs in the book, and yet this chapter is primarily about her counterpart in this scene, Kellen Murdock, going by Murdock and his many nicknames that he gets through his many tours in Iraq as an explosives.
My personal favorite is Manfuck, but
yeah, I'm with you too.
Yeah, Murder is a good one too.
Uncle Murder.
Uncle Murder. Ooh, tough. Right. So Shane is this activist, right? She came up in anti-war activism, and he is a veteran. And they met in anti-war activism, but he as a veteran and she as a idealistic college student, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Iraq veterans against the war. This is such a chapter so saturated by the war on terror, and so the specificity of so much of it, including IVA or the movies or the surge or all of the different aspects of this were impressive and in a strange way to set up a climate novel.
I know, maybe not really. So in the conversation we were having last time about can we draw parallels between these moments in history?
Yes.
There were actually some details about the war that were so specific that I did not remember. I mean, I was pretty young when it started. I mean, if we think about everything really beginning in 2001, I mean, I was born in 1988. I was an adolescent at the time. And the place that I grew up was fairly conservative, but there was an interesting way in which the war kind of rocked what little political tension there was there, because it's a very much a military town, but it does have a vibrant kind of hippie contingent. And so when people would protest, it was this affront, So I grew up mostly seeing the anger directed at protesters rather than seeing anger directed at the war. That was sort of my context. So this chapter was fascinating for me, but I didn't remember what he makes reference to the child boy president waving a banner that says something, and he doesn't say what it was, and I didn't remember what that was.
Yeah, classic mission accomplished.
Yeah,
bullshit.
Yeah, and I had to look it up, and I was like, oh shit, just totally forgot.
I chose not to look up whether the stuffing a sock down his pants was a true historical detail or not of W, but I hope that it was in a really dark way.
I didn't want it to be confirmed that it was not, so I did not look it up. Yeah,
print the legend, so on and so forth.
But I guess the other important thing about this chapter is that it's a conversation. It takes place all in one setting. They're sitting in a diner. They've not ordered food, right? Shane keeps gesturing to the server, right? Don't come over, we're not ready. And we get one text box of the server's inner monologue being like, what the fuck is wrong with these people? Trying to figure out if they're on a date or what.
Yeah, it's a conversation, but it's a more than 2-person conversation, right? Because we get the server's text box, we get one of the other patrons of Bob Evans, right? His thoughts on the matter. They're both wondering, is this a date or not? And then, of course, we have what Murdock is saying to Shane in all of the text boxes,
right?
With Murdock's inner thoughts and reactions.
Right. And then the format is really quite fascinating because almost every page has a text box or two of a variety of sizes. And there's no context or explanation for where those text boxes are coming from, but they very clearly supplement. They're background for specific things that either Shane or Murdock are saying in their conversation. And mostly, I would argue, Murdock.
Yes, I
agree
with that.
Far more context for his comments than there is for hers. Yeah. And we catch on pretty quickly that she's trying to recruit him for something.
Something that's going to bring about real change.
Yes. So thus the manifesto, right?
Absolutely.
Revolution or reform.
The classic question.
The classic dilemma.
I'm sure we probably problematize all the time and are teaching both of us.
Right. Just another binary. Guys. Do we need any other plot notes before we?
I think it's time to diagnose the current condition. And I believe you're going to start us off, Emily.
I would love to. Okay, something that really struck me in this chapter is the repeated juxtaposition of him as a soldier coming to his critique of war and her as a liberal college student coming to her critique of war. So which is why I loved how you set that up just in your one sentence summary. Like these two people come from these opposite places and they met at some sort of ideological point, but they're trying to suss out whether or not they are still in agreement about some things, or like what it is that they agree on and why they agree on it and how they come to that agreement or disagreement or something. And I thought that was really a really fascinating kind of theme. And I was wondering sort of what we make of like what that juxtaposition is trying to tell us. Is it making an argument? Is it probing us to, I don't know, grapple with our own standpoints? Is it a little bit of both? And I thought there was just, and so many other kind of like smaller themes or even arguably bigger themes kind of brush up against that mechanism. So I thought of it as both like a theme and a mechanism. And I was curious if you like had any thoughts kind of about that as both a structure and like a thread of its own.
Yeah, I really like that framing. I think it being both a mechanism and a theme makes perfect sense because there's a lot of things that this chapter is doing that are tangential on the surface to like the climate novel, but which immediately like, and as one reads through the book, like will become more and more obvious kind of what the connections are. But like your point about them coming to activism or coming to an anti-war standpoint in different ways is, I think, a really useful way to think about what this chapter is doing in terms of what is the perception or what is hegemonic perception versus what is reality. Like that could be of the Iraq War, it could be of the global war on terror, it could be of explosives ordnance detonation, it could be of climate change, even if that's not the like direct subject of this chapter. There's questions about like what it means to be politicized that's so deeply tied to this chapter. And it's one of the reasons that like it speaks to me as a chapter because like I was in college from 2005 to 2009, right? So like I was politicized during that time, like in the Bush years and the global war on terror years. And so like I, and like was at events like where Iraq Veterans Against the War people were speaking and like leading stuff. So that spoke to me. And then there's also this like allure or glory of war, but also simultaneous like disenchantment or like denial of the allure or glory of war as both this thing that is epic and cliche. And all of those things are, I think, weaving through your like point about the different relationships they have to one another and then to anti-war activism or radicalism broadly.
Yeah, I love these moments where Shane is like dealing with I think she's sort of like, it's like sexy to her to listen to Murdock talk about war because he's been there and he's seen it and she hasn't. And she's like, has these like really lofty political critiques of war as like an institution, as a sort of like political economy. If we could talk about, what circulates in war aside from soldiers and, civilians, right? And but she's like recognizes in her this, I don't know, like absence of like I want to go to combat perversely, sort of, even though I know all these things that I know about what it is and how it props up other things that are problematic in the world. And there are like glancing, I think, references to climate change in here, which is interesting.
Definitely.
So maybe we could talk about like why put a chapter on war second, right, in this climate change novel. But I thought that her like, and it's not even veiled like psychoanalytic, like a libidinal attraction to war. It's like she recognizes it as sexual, like explicitly sexual, right?
Right.
Which I thought was really fascinating.
That's true both of like they hooked up after the IVA event in 07 and then also in this conversation, right? So like this is page 23. She was circling him, but Shane also did love hearing about war. Though she'd begun her adulthood organizing against the country's major military misadventures, a part of her ached for combat. She envied the sense of purpose, the action, the definitive stamp of finality, and meaning war seemed to imprint on its participants.
Mm-hmm.
And as as a surface, right? Because it's so direct and explicit, like understanding of or engagement with like what is the psychology of the radical activist
Mm-hmm.
and what are like the leftist militant dreams that those radical activists may hold. I think that this chapter sets up a kind of like basic root structure to like potentially explore that over the course of the rest of the novel. And like that you point out that it has this sexualized edge to it as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. So that somewhat perhaps paradox that these super radical activists longs for nothing more than to go to combat, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So interesting. And I thought in that vein, the text boxes that deal with his professor, his like super Marxist professor who was also a veteran, were awesome. Because that's a different, right? That's different than Shane versus Murdock's perspective.
Yeah.
But it's not quite Murdock's, like it's not just future Murdock, right? It's like this guy had a particular perspective from Vietnam that led him to Marxism, right? That led him to what does he teach again?
He teaches military history.
Military history, right? Yeah. Like what a wild thing to go into and to like and I don't think it gets into this particularly, but it's right. Like probably the trajectory is not like Vietnam Marx history. Probably it was like Vietnam. I don't know. I guess I'll go back to university and then like I have this military background, so maybe history, and then probably like Marx and military history sort of emerge in his, I don't know, as his sort of path simultaneously would be my guess. I don't know, but maybe he read Marx in Vietnam.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, because the professor like came back from the war and immediately was like throwing his medals on the ground and stuff like this, right? So like, yeah, you're right that there's this added layer of politicization and like how different wars interact with different ideological formations or like theoretical formations to like generate an anti-war perspective. I love it. And then like, you know, he's assigning Chomsky and Chalmers Johnson and stuff to Murdock in office hours.
Yeah.
But like there's that embrace of the reality of it or recognition of the reality of it that like for the professor, for Murdock is such a visceral, experiential like active part of their lives. And for Shane, it's this kind of like idealized, right? Scary, dangerous, but thus appealing dimension of life or human existence or, you know, intrasubjective existence at the same time that's destructive and denying of subjectivity or the self or whatever, right? So like there's something about not only the past relationship to Murdock, but also like the present relationship to Murdock, you know, potentially like the dream of what it is Shane is recruiting Murdock for and all of that is like her trying to get as close as she can right, to experiencing something like Murdock, or to your point, Murdock's professor when he went to Penn State was.
I had an interesting thought where I was wondering, so it seemed to me like Stephen Markley here is setting up and why maybe the manifesto format actually works really well, that he's setting up sort of like two different diagnoses of like why war is bad, one through Shane and one through Murdock and arguably a little bit through the professor. And I wonder if they're like, if we could maybe try to flesh out exactly what they are and how they're different, and B, are they complementary or are they in disagreement with each other? You know what I mean? Because to my mind, I think his is more like almost in line with some of the stuff that comes out of transnational feminisms on like nationalism, right? That like this, that war is like one of the ways that nationalism, or sort of like almost like an apex of nationalism was kind of how I was envisioning it, but that the nationalism cloaks the like destruction almost. And it's not even just like, oh, we are bad because we took advantage of a country and used Americanism and Orientalism to justify this exploitative, you know, imperialist project. But it's like we've fooled ourselves, right? And the people we send are the ones getting harmed. And so it's almost like the other is sort of not the point in a way. And then I wasn't quite, hers is I think a little like military industrial capitalism, the whole thing kind of thing. And I wonder if it's like we're supposed to read hers as less defined because of her experience as an activist and not as a soldier, or like I don't know if he's portraying one or the other as more right. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think they're complementary, and I think there's like a little bit of a thesis statement for the book as to why they're complementary, but I want to actually save that to pick up on that last point And that I think it's an approach that is in some ways probing, like, is it possible to talk about war or climate? Like, is it possible to make an anti-war film, is the like cliche quote from, I think, Trufant or something?
Yeah.
And maybe like the version of that for Markley is, can you become like a climate justice activist through reading a novel? Right. And that there's something about the like that Murdock is both the thing which reading a book about climate change can never do. And yet, especially through the text boxes, like he's going to try to put us inside of that person's psyche as much as he possibly can. It is like him trying to do and trying to reconcile, as you point out, with Shane's like slightly more detached, but by necessity, not like detached as a negative, just detached as a descriptor of her relationship, like the distance she has from war itself. And, you know, maybe I don't think the novel is like necessarily consciously, or maybe it is, or intentionally trying to reconcile like the visceral with the ideological, or the visceral with the theoretical, or the visceral with the abstract. But like maybe that's one of the ways we can try to read or analyze their two different standpoints in relationship to one another.
Well, that kind of reminds me of the conversation we had about Tony, like shifting from the formal scientific to the prosaic, right? And like maybe that's another kind of, I don't know, moment of that encounter between the two. That's right. The reconciling of the things that sort of appear irreconcilable, but and like that they're not perfectly reconcilable is, I think, part of the point, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And like this is against the background of like kind of everything being a cliche, right? Like where the chapter kind of ends is that war is just a cliche.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's one of Murdock's final text boxes. This is like page 32. And so there's that like allure or glory of war, but also the contrast with the tedium everyday life, as Murdock does quite directly. And Shane kind of, you know, I think it's perceptive of you to point out the way in which like Shane is reaching for like action for war in this whatever project she's working on. And there's always though this like undercutting of the allure, the glory of war as this like proving ground of human experience and like existential confrontation with violence and self and others.
Oh, so keep the mundane in mind as a sort of cryptic foreshadowing moment.
Yes,
yeah.
definitely.
Interesting.
Can I give you what I think that one of the thesis statements of the novel is?
Yeah.
So this is on page 19, and this is the point at which Murdock and Shane's perspectives actually come together. Is the question is, how do you, quote, put invisible infrastructures in front of people, end quote, right? And like the question, the direct point of conversation between the two characters is a war, right? And like the US military industrial complex, nationalism, imperialism, all of these sorts of things, right? So that's the kind of theoretical version. And then Murdock, in like a very Marx, David Harvey sort of way, goes to like, how do you this ketchup arrive at this table that we're sitting at, right? Which is a, you know, a version of like, I think this is David Harvey technique. Like you teach commodity fetishism in Marx by asking like one student, what did you have for breakfast? And then you as a class trace like every single form of labor and every kind of like resource and every like person that is actually you are in relation with through that, whatever you had for breakfast. So like that's the moment. But like I think as a kind of broader, what is this novel trying to do? Like putting the invisible infrastructures in front of people in the many forms of this novel is maybe what Markley is trying to do.
I love that. Yeah. And I think back to your point about the sort of bringing together of the kind of abstract and the visceral, right? That invisible infrastructure are not abstract, that they are like actually visceral is maybe part of the strategy, some of the rhetoric strategy.
Yeah. Oh, I hadn't thought of that, right? Because there's a way in which like the text boxes put Murdock's invisible infrastructure on display for a reader in the way that almost any other form of telling the story would not give us access to.
Right. And like part of the thing that's, I think, attractive to Shane about him in this chapter is that she doesn't get that, right? So she senses that there's something else behind that sentence, that, you know, utterance, but she doesn't probe it. And he's not open to sharing that with her, right? This is like a part of him that's definitely not up, like, you know, and he recognizes that she's working him, right?
Yes.
And he's letting himself to a certain extent submit to that, but there's a place she can't get to, right? And she can sense that, but she doesn't get it. So we get it, right? And so we know exactly what it is that she's getting right or getting wrong, and kind of like where she, I think, presents herself as sort of hardened and strategic, but like there's this whole underneath, or I don't know what the right metaphor is, that she's not getting. I don't know if she almost comes off like a little silly in this chapter. I don't know, to be so, I hadn't thought of that on the first time I read it, but talking through this now, right, that she's so secretive, right?
Yes.
She's
Yes.
so, what's the word I'm looking for? That's she's sort of like using kind of conversational cloaks and daggers. She won't say anything outright. It's
Cryptic.
like it's cryptic, but it's also like, it's sort of like she's already kind of speaking in code.
Yes.
As though they're already in this kind of hyper secret mission. And he's like, that's not what secret missions look like. Secret missions are like,
you roll out with 50 people, everyone's shooting at you, and you have to defuse a bomb in 60 seconds. So you're going to be picking through viscera.
And you don't know who you're shooting at or who's shooting at you. But it's also paired with this, this constant talk of sodomy and incest has a home base in his gray matter kind of thing, right? Which is the way that he describes the humor kind of in the army, right? And he says everyone's funny to some degree in this context, which is just like, okay, sure. But she's playing.
Yes.
Pretend.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And like that also, this is the third time I've read the book, and like this came through way more this read, even before we started talking, than other reads. Because Shane is like smart, intentional, careful, and thoughtful, and like clearly has a plan and idea and the like theory behind why to do it. And also like it's the play, or it's the pretend, or it's the like, she never quite giggles, but she like has the start of like a laugh, like, isn't this cool? Like what we're doing right here, having this conversation maybe 2 or 3 times in the chapter. And that, and that gets into like the, those questions about like their different standpoints. And it's also a little bit about the different like genres that this chapter is, right? Because this chapter is a political thriller or spy thriller, right? Like somebody is recruiting someone else for a secret mission. But it's also a kind of like little bit coming of age of the activist chapter for Shane in the ways that you've identified. And then I think more than anything else, it's a like coming home from the war novel for Murdock.
Yeah. And then also there's this other, this other entity kind of floating around, right? Which we could talk about in a minute. I was wondering too, what you made of the whole, I'm trying to look, I didn't note exactly how many pages, but I think there's like a significant chunk of the chapter sort of devoted to memory and like the type of memory loss or type of traumatic brain injury that's specific to war. And I was wondering if there's a sort of anything meta going on there. I mean, I think to your point, it's very much part of the genre of coming home from war, right? Like this is the trauma of war. This is what happens after, right? And I think what we get in some of the organization of this chapter is like, there is no after.
Right. Yes.
Linear time isn't real, right? And especially when you take into account the problem of memory and remembering and, I don't know, post-traumatic stress, right? In the more clinical sense. So I thought that was like an interesting thing to do in a book about climate change, right? To think about both collective memory and individual memory and the problem of the time horizon, right? Like, are we, to what extent are we still in the war in Iraq? You know what I mean? Like both physically and like psychologically and as a collective, but also for Murdock specifically as an individual. And I think those questions are really fascinating.
They are. I mean, they apply to climate change, because I'm thinking that. So I taught environmental political thought fall 2023, and it's like all traditional age college students. I'm up there at the front of the room, like in my late 30s. Then there's one student who is in his early 60s, and he's like, I remember the hockey stick graph. Like I was there for that when like it was first happening. So it was interesting to think about like, what are the things that just through like my own or my like students kind of perspectives on what is the memory of climate change debates prior to the past X number of years. And it is in fact much deeper than like I necessarily appreciate. So I think that there's that aspect, but there's also a way in which this is both shoring up the reliability or like verifiability of what's happening in this novel, because we get what appears to be such a like deep tap into the inner psyche of Murdock in this chapter. But it's also in the way you pointed out, like an possible undermining of the reliability of like any character remembering the past or talking about the past going forward, because Shane and Murdock, neither of them are fully coming out into the open or necessarily fully remembering in some like quote unquote objective true sense,
right,
like what the past is. So there's a little bit about like how
even
do
their encounter with each other, right?
precisely,
Yeah.
precisely, yeah.
Well, and right, we learned sort of through the conversation that she maybe is not who she says she is.
Oh, definitely.
Right? She goes by a different name, and he says, "Do I even know you?" And she says, "You don't know my name, but you know me." Right? Which is like, what does that tell us about? Yeah. I also thought it was interesting, kind of drawing another connection to our conversation from last time, that one of the boxes on memory loss has the heading "Read up on science." And it starts with, right, the like, this is how the explosive waves work.
Yeah.
And here's what happens when it reaches the skull. And then it ends with, he stops speaking to all of his explosive detonating buddies, right? They all talked about lost memories, lost sleep, right? And he's like, and he does this thing where he says he hadn't thought about any of the memories that he tagged before. And like now his whole life is this one period rather than the whole thing, right? Which I just think is a really interesting commentary on like time and space.
Yeah.
Even? Yeah.
Yeah. I think we should go there.
Time and space.
Yeah. Much like, okay, I'll do the obvious segue here, but there's also a way in which like the existence of these text boxes themselves are questions about time and space.
Yes.
So like as a reader, like when you first encounter these text boxes, what did you think of them and how did you read them? Like, are you reading like the normal text and then the text boxes? Are you going back and forth? Occasionally there are arrows, but like there's zero directions to your point. There's zero context.
Yeah.
And how to do it.
The first time I read the book, I was very confused about how to read them because I read it on a Kindle. Because it was 900 pages, and I was in California, and I didn't want to carry it with me. And
so
they work.
Question for you: were they interspersed in the text in the Kindle version, or like because I had one student who read this as an ebook, or read this as an audiobook, I should say, and all of the text boxes for the student were put in at the end of the chapter.
Whoa. Okay. So the Kindle does a better job of integrating it. But it was, I think, seeing it on the page as Stephen Markley intended is also interesting because some of them, what I found myself trying to do is trying to figure out where in the page the text box went and sort of like almost unconsciously making like footnotes, right? Like this one goes here, this one goes here. And then I was like, why am I doing that? But they're all in like past tense, but some of them are like add-ons to the current conversation, and some of them are add-ons to the memories, which I thought was really interesting. Yeah. It's very hard. I mean, I honestly had no idea what the format of them was intended to serve. It was clear that the text boxes themselves are supplementing the what's not being said in the conversation, right? To the point we were talking about earlier about their like what she can't access in him, right? And sort of conversely, like what he can't access in her, right?
Yeah.
But I was truly baffled by the arrangement of the boxes themselves.
Baffled, and also like, because I think we said on the first episode, and I'm sure we talked about it on the prologue, you recommended this book to me, and like I got to this chapter and I was like, oh shit, like okay, this is real. Like what's happening here? Like this is different. This is different in terms of what kind of book this is than I was expecting. Right? When we're like, oh, okay, so we have the second character, fine, no big deal. I didn't know that there were going to be six POVs at that point, like all written somewhat differently. And it's like, oh, it's a different character, fine. And then like you're confronted with these text boxes, and like, what do you do with them? What do you do with them practically, and what do you do with them in terms of assimilating them to one's experience of reading the novel or thinking about the novel or like connecting the novel to the quote unquote real world or whatever, is also just like it's a way to activate a reader if they're willing to go along on the journey, and maybe like not everyone is like maybe. And selling this, I sold this book so hard to my students before we got going because like A, it's 900 pages, and B, it's weird and hard to read because of the formal and stylistic choices that he makes, most of which I think quite work exceptionally well. But yeah, like we had conversations about like how do you read the text boxes, right? And like people's different strategies for them. And also, I told them, and here's our cryptic foreshadowing, like I'm not someone, whether it's a movie or a TV show or a book, the theorizing or the like predicting the thing that is about to happen is like not what I'm interested in, and conveniently is also something I'm bad at, so that works really well for me. And I told them like, but if you're that kind of reader or that kind of thinker and like you enjoy making theories about the thing things that you read.
Make
Make
a
a theory
theory.
about what these text boxes are.
Ooh, that's a great cryptic foreshadow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I'm much more interested in like, what is it saying that it's not saying? It's saying that's sort of like
Yep.
how I read and watch everything.
Yes.
And I get, told by my, for lack of a better word, layperson friends that I like read too much into it. And I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
the whole, that's just
Well,
how I read.
yeah. Like
That's
what
what
else?
reading
What else is
is.
there? Yeah.
Read into it. But I think it's funny that choice of words, because I would argue that we read in and read out, right? And if we're using that sort of spatial
I love it.
conceit.
I love it.
But
I'll also just point out that like the text boxes take up more and more space as this chapter goes on, right? So like page 31, we're almost at the end of the chapter, and it's like, here's just a page of the text boxes.
Yeah.
And it's as Shane is making the ask of Murdock, right? So there's something about like whatever other things these text boxes are doing with regards to memory and experience and more and Murdock's psyche and all of that. It's like the ask that is never quite explicit, but like becomes more explicit as an ask and a recruitment. It like activates Murdock's psyche and activates the text boxes even more than they had already been present throughout the chapter.
For me, that last few pages really ticked up in anxiety.
Yes, of course.
Like having all that text alongside the conversation just made it feel like, oh, everything in the background is like kicked up to like, double speed. And then there's and then the question at the end, right? Which is, should we turn to that question and then pivot to our theory section?
I think so.
Right. So there's this like flurry of background text box happening. And then she says, look, Kel, we can go through this shit to the moon and back. In fact, at some point, I'm sure we will. But for now, I just want to know. She slides the salt shaker back to her hand, right? If you've got one more war in you. And then there's like some description of the restaurant.
Yeah.
And then the waitress returns and they order breakfast, right? And that's like the final sentence. Yeah.
Incredible. Great stuff.
So good. And also this like text box to end with the text box. I mean, I guess we'll get there when we get to our characters, but the text box that he ends with is a kind of alternate memory, right? A memory that never happened, which is, I just think, a fascinating pair with ending it on this not quite asked question, right? Yeah.
And that final text box that's a memory that never happened is just labeled and yet, right? So it's like, now that we're down this road, which is very, fourth wall breaking, this is a fourth wall breaking novel at times, I think.
I think so too.
Yet,
yeah.
Which is the memory that doesn't happen, and there's the memory that is happen, right? He's at this war memorial in Florida, right? And we'll read here the final words, I think, of this chapter. Like spatially, they're the final words of the chapter. So we'll give it. An older black lady, probably the mother of some other poor dead motherfucker, knelt beside him and took him in her arms. She whispered, I know, baby, I know. We'll all be with God soon. While she stroked his back with one hand and held his heart with the other.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Man. Should we pivot to...
We should. What have others gotten right and others gotten wrong? Crucial questions for any political manifesto. Also crucial questions for a climate change novel in this chapter. Why don't you kick off our theory exploration of what others get right and wrong?
Okay, well, it's actually quite funny that you read from one of your arguments for a central thesis of the book was on page 19, because page 19 really struck me as a kind of like potential theoretical center of this chapter. So you have Shane saying, sometimes I think it was better when American kids were dying, it put invisible infrastructure in front of people. Now that you've got a liberal building a surveillance state and assassinating extrajudicially via robot, no one seems all that bothered, right? So ostensibly Obama.
Yeah.
And then he does the David Harvey Marx thing, but he says, time marches on, getting caught up in causes doesn't interest me, not anymore, especially when you see the scope of what this is. He takes the Heinz ketchup bottle. That's the thing. Most people don't understand this. The ingredients, where it goes, where the energy comes from to create it, the way the world's got to be directed and coaxed and violated and controlled. I think also there's some climate change critique in there.
For sure.
To get this one little fucked bottle. And once you see how ketchup relates to imperial maintenance, it's tough not to get an overwhelmed quality to your thinking, like one of them magic eye thingamajobs. Hard the first time, but once you get it, you'll never unsee it.
Great writing.
So good. But I thought this was really interesting because I think they're looking at almost two different kind of theoretical approaches to the same problem. So I think you have like Shane here almost taking a kind of Foucault route.
Yeah.
And then I think you have Murdock here, not even going like Marx David Harvey, but going like Giovanni Arrighi.
Ooh, I love that.
That like capitalism, the one of the kind of features of a global capitalist world is like the paradigm shifts in political power, right? So you have this idea that it's not just these kind of like nameless, faceless waves of capital accumulation and the owners that are sort of profiting off or benefiting from the surplus or the capitalist dividend, right? That like historically that shifts in capital accumulation and shifts from, right, a kind of industrial capitalism to other kinds of monsters or formations of capitalism are part of also the shifts in global political power, and that like states, like the state and capitalism are not, we can't treat them as distinct entities, is what I take as one of his like historical analytic arguments. And I think Murdock is doing that here, right?
Yes,
he's talking
absolutely.
about catch-up, but he's also talking about American imperialism in
catch-up is
particular.
imperial maintenance.
Yes, and it's specific to this moment of American imperialism. It's not just imperialism. Capitalism is not just like he's saying capitalism is imperialism on a bumper sticker or a tote bag is not the right analysis, right? And I think that that's such an interesting way to think about maybe like the difference between somebody like Foucault and somebody like Arrighi, right? That like that Foucault has this brilliant, and it's historically grounded, right? But it's a sort of like neutral description in some way of the process of consolidation and congealing of like surveillance on one hand, and the modern neoliberal state, and on the other hand, right, the like forces of the economy. But like it doesn't go carry it all the way to its end or sort of carry it all the way back, right? And like Arrighi's big sort of like gimmick is the book is called The Long 20th Century, but it's like a 700-year history of capitalism, right? And so like, which is, I think, funny in a like, you know, academic millennial comedy way.
And in the spirit of this chapter of the book, right? In the darkness of the humor.
So I thought that that page like really encapsulated a lot of arguments on the left about method and about what it means to do theory, like even just sort of like methodological arguments within like the discipline of political theory, right? Like, are we doing historicism? Are we doing contextualism? Are we doing just like analytic philosophy, right? Like, what is it that we're doing? And I think that her saying invisible infrastructures and, you know, liberal building a surveillance state and assassinating extrajudiciously via robot, and him saying, no, this fucking catch up is imperialism. And like, I had to watch people get juiced, right? And like, this is what it was all for, right? That like, I that just totally encapsulated some of those debates for me. And I thought it was really brilliant.
Right. I mean, even like the Shane, right? We get our like touchstones of like aughts, like leftism, right? Like you have your Agamben, you have your Foucault, right? And like, cool, those are, you know, the two genders, like of leftism and the aughts, right? So no, I really appreciate that, like that Arrighi helps Murdock and helps us think about that. Like, where would you put Luxemburg in the like? Is Luxemburg a Shane a theorist, or is Luxemburg a Murdock theorist?
That's hard because I think in some moments she is Shane, but she's like informed, especially vis-a-vis the stuff about what Marx missed in terms of gender and sex and sexuality, right? That like that always feels like very personal, I think, in her work, in the way that Murdock's like, I watched people get juiced so you could eat this so you could pour this tomato juice, right? Like on your, like there's like like that he picks ketchup, right, is I think not so incidental, right? It's like that's what kids put on themselves when they're pretending to be bloody and shot, right? And like I don't know, it just was so perfect to me. And I think Luxemburg has moments of both.
I was thinking about it in terms of there's a way in which she does provide the overarching, like in all times and places, you know, primitive accumulation continues, like imperialism is primitive accumulation, it's ongoing, it's not a one-time thing. Like we need to find new zones in which to realize surplus value, et cetera, et cetera. And so like there's the kind of broad sweeping narrative, but then there's also so much specificity in her work, particularly her thinking about imperialism, that like I think it fits the different kinds of elements you're
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a great poll.
Thank you.
Yeah. You're gonna laugh at me for mine. Okay, so I have other ones that are more Emily and John core, but the one I'm going to go with most of all is Slavoj Žižek's "Welcome to the Desert of the Real."
Stop.
I am so opposed to taking Slavoj Žižek seriously. But like this little 2002, like it's not even like really a full book. It's a very short book on 9/11 and that war in Afghanistan and like the early war on terror is, I think, an extremely useful way, like to think about the war on terror in general. It was like a very crucial book in my own intellectual formation, like in the, like, let's say mid to late aughts, like reading that book and like reading kind of different forms of leftist analysis and theoretical analysis of war on terror and Bush and imperialism and all of that. And the question about like, what is the real that we think is real and what is the real? And like, he's doing it through the Lacan psychoanalysis thing, which like is not a particular area of expertise for me, but just the like sense that there's this much deeper sense of reality that we are always trying to like compensate for or like send things up to produce or to like inhabit that space is, I think, just a really useful way of thinking about the war on terror and a useful way of getting to some of the different standpoints that Shane and Murdock have on the war on terror, on the Iraq War, like on American imperialism, right? So like, you know, this is like page 33 of Welcome to the Desert of the Real. It is, quote, "It is the awareness that we live in an insulated artificial universe which generates the notion that some ominous agent is threatening us all the time with total destruction. In this paranoiac perspective, the terrorists are turned into an irrational, abstract agency."
Oh my God.
Which is like extreme Zizek.
Yeah, so
and like one of the closing ideas of this, and I promise this is the last Zizek quote that I will ever read on this podcast, is on 154, quote, "What if the true aim of this war is ourselves, our own ideological mobilization against the threat of the capital A act," which is also very Zizek word. But
so funny. I am laughing so much. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
That was what I hoped would happen. Yeah. And it's extremely deserved to laugh at me going to Zizek.
So good.
But there's a way in which like, so Zizek in some ways, I think this is wild. I'm going to say this, but like he's trying to reconcile the Shane and the Murdock. Right? He's trying to reconcile the experiential or visceral with the somewhat more like abstract theoretical. Right. And there's a way in which like we could map it that like, okay, so what is Zizek trying to do more broadly? He's like trying to reconcile like Lacan and Marx and Hegel and like sometimes too. I think like those are at the core. And
right. He's trying to argue that they're not antithetical to one another.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
They can be reconciled. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that part of my turning to Zizek in a true out of character moment is to like try to, you know, Hegel synthesis my way out of the different standpoints of this chapter.
I love that.
I got Zizek.
Perfect. What was the one you were thinking about going with?
So like the ones that are more, I think, us is just like all of the like transnational feminist and feminist IR scholarship on the war on terror, right? So like two things.
That's funny that was one of the first things I said. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I laughed when you said that. Is so there's like this piece by like Mino Mooallem, who's fundamentalism, from this 2002 section in Meridians. It's a journal issue with a section called September 11th, a Feminist Archive.
Yeah.
There's some great pieces in there. And that's kind of the like transnational feminist perspective I was thinking about. But also like, this is the feminist IR part, like Laura Shepard's article, Veiled References, Constructions of Gender and the Bush Administration Discourse on the Attacks on Afghanistan post 9/11 in the International Journal of Feminist Politics. So like, that was also a core way in which I, like essentially my route into theory was through feminist IR. So like I always have this soft spot for feminist soft spots. It's interesting phrase to use.
Yeah.
I
was even thinking like Jasper Puar, right?
Yes,
like
exactly.
Some of the stuff, especially juxtaposing like the way the men on the ground talk to each other, right? That they're not, you know, Murdock says, "Oh, I was drawn to the war because I was rah-rah America," right? And then I got there and I was like, what is it all for? Like, like, what have I been, who do I know how to trust, right? But like, he talks about everyone as sort of like buying into the cause, but that's also not really why they're all there. And they're all just kind of like messing around and saying shit like, locker room talking or whatever. And it's like, how that part maybe complements or adds something to what Buar is setting up with, like, the construction of nationalism as being particularly hetero in opposition to the like deviance, right, of the other. And that's all, she talks a lot about how that gets constructed in like popular media and stuff like that. But that to also think about the reverberations of that, like on the ground, like quite literally, right?
Yes.
Is I think potentially really useful. Like I think
because Murdock is doing both, right? He is exoticizing the woman in the hijab and also is like thinking deeply through the core like Western rationality of their toy counterpart, right? Like the bomb maker who is using children's toys to make bombs. Like both of those are part of Murdock's like broader ideological formation.
Yeah, I was thinking too. This was only a little touchstone for me because I think what was more interesting to me in this chapter is their tension with each other. But I was thinking a lot about Butler's precarious life, which also has essays particularly responding to 9/11 and this idea of like which lives do we mourn, right? And who gets mourned publicly and whose deaths are sort of celebrated. And I think there's a little bit of that here, but it's not quite developed and it hasn't yet. I think this is something that might come up later, right? Like not only whose lives are worth mourning, but also whose deaths are legitimate.
Yes.
And which I think, and this is like also my not remembering the book, but also maybe a cryptic foreshadowing. I think that becomes relevant later.
Yes. Yeah. There'll be many Butler opportunities of various kinds.
Beautiful.
Throughout our journey.
Okay. I thought I had so many thoughts about different cultural artifacts to put in conversation with this chapter.
I do. We have to start with the essential question that both of us independently came to, which is it cheating to use the movies? So The Hurt Locker and American Sniper are the two movies that are directly referenced in this chapter. So the Global War on Terror film canon is like the obvious touch point here. Like Zero Dark 30 belongs in there.
Yeah.
Jarhead arguably belongs in there, like some others. Side note, there is a good podcast. It's called Schlock and Awe by two like kind of leftist journalists where they like re-examine the Global War on Terror film canon.
Oh, interesting. I should listen to that. That sounds like something I'd
There's
love.
only a couple episodes. I'm not sure if it'll continue or not, but like the couple of episodes that exist are high quality.
Yeah. Yeah. So the chapter opens with them discussing the Hurt Locker. And she says, I don't know, I felt like I needed a defibrillator. And he's like, fairy tale, ridiculous, could never watch it. And so one of the questions that runs through is like, can there be, I don't know, how do you do a war movie? Like,
I have some thoughts about that in the humor section.
Great. I mean, I don't think it's cheating to talk about that in the future. But I think, we brought some other things. So maybe that's just the model we could use moving forward. I like
that. I know you have a couple, but what's like your core cultural artifact?
So this chapter screamed Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, which I put in artifact and not theory because for a couple of reasons. One, I think what she does in that book, there is a theoretical argument, but it is such a detailed journalistic account of very specific contexts and moments in time. And the Iraq chapter in particular is like just receipts, right? Like, here's what the government did. Here's what the American government did. Here were the conversations behind closed doors about what they should do and what should be public facing and what should not. Here are the actual contracts. Here are what the contractors did, right? Here's what's left. Here's what happened to the Iraqi people, right? It's just like, it's basically a laundry list of crimes. And so, and she writes it, it's a big book, but she writes it for a lay audience, right? It's supposed to be for anyone who's interested in like why. And I think of her as grappling with one of the questions in a different way that like 20th century, early mid 20th century, like French and German philosophy was dealing with, which is like, okay, the Enlightenment was supposed to bring us all this progress and peace and prosperity and freedom, and everywhere, everyone is murdering, right? And like, I think Klein is dealing with that question, like capitalism was supposed to bring us prosperity, and yet like the world is sort of like on fire and crumbling, and so many people are poor, right? And she finds this pattern in capitalism that's sort of like endemic to the prosperity, a certain level of prosperity in capitalism, which is that disasters fuel, right? Like like new moments or iterations of the rearrangement of capital relations and the intensification of surplus, right? But like the hands change, the players change, right? And she just does it. She makes that argument over and over and over again by different contexts. And the Iraq chapter is just like, it's horrifying if you lived through it. You know what I mean? To think that like, oh, this is where my catch up came from, right? To like bring her and Murdock to bear on one another. So I just thought it's worth like this is like one, we get the like inner life of what she's tracing at a bigger scale. But it's not yet up to the abstract. It's not yet up to the like invisible infrastructure, you know, supposedly democratic regime sending out robo death. It's like, it's still very hyper specific. And so I think I just think everyone should read it.
Yeah. And I think presenting it as a cultural artifact in the construct of its relationship to the text and then in our podcast makes perfect sense because like, especially vis-a-vis Shane, right? Because like Klein is such an important place where like the theory and the praxis meet in a certain way. And just like her centrality to, or like shorthand reference, like in like leftist organizing or activist spaces too, right? And that's true about the shock doctrine, and it's true about climate change, right? That like shock doctrine and this changes everything are just two absolutely foundational texts in so many different ways. And like I like thinking of that as a cultural artifact.
That's what else I was going to say too. Just that Naomi Klein goes from the shock doctrine, like war and disaster and who profits off of that, to her next book is climate change, right? Yep. Like that to me is just like an important thing.
Yeah, she's Murdock. I love it. I think I'm going to go with mine. Generally, like indie rockers against George Bush. There's this like moment when I started getting into music in like the mid-aughts where every indie rock album, whether like they're American and Canadian or wherever else, like and whatever else the album is about, like there's going to be one anti-Bush song. Like, a lot of these get collected in like the Rock Against Bush like compilations or whatever. You know, like we have like very mainstream things like American Idiot are touch points for this as well, of course. But the one like prime example when I think about this is the song "He Lied About Death" by like the like Canadian indie rockers Stars. Like, did you ever have a Stars moment?
Oh yeah.
I'm not surprised to hear that. So did I. And like this album, which I think is "Set Yourself on Fire" or as the album title, is primarily and is primarily about like, you know, songs about relationships falling apart and having sex and like how do you come together and fall away from people. And then towards the end of it, you get this like musically different kind of song than a lot of the rest of the album, though there's some connective tissue. But like thematically, well, the final two songs of that album are a little bit kind of in conversation with "He Lied About Death." But like this is a very, very confrontational, melodic anti-Bush song that also has like some discordant elements that I think are really cool and really effective too. Then, and including the famous line, "I hope your drunken daughters are gay."
Ooh, which is like, so good. Right? Is that the same album that Your Ex-Lover Is Dead is on? I was just trying to look it up. Yeah. That song was like in heavy rotation for a long time.
Yeah. So like you have these Canadian indie rockers making an album that's like primarily like Your Ex-Lover Is Dead is like thematically a more of a touchstone for that album. And yet like He Lied About Death is there. And like this is a pattern that just recurs from like 2002, 2003 through like 2007 in so many indie rock albums of the era.
I love that so much.
So I'm going with Stars.
Perfect.
He Lied About Death.
He Lied About Death. Okay, I have two other little ones, if that's
Please.
Okay. So one is that I just finished this book, In Memoriam by Alice Wynne, that is about World War I, but it's really, really good. It's these two boys and they're boys, right, who come from really wealthy English families, and they're like in boarding school together, and they're in love with each other, but both of them, one of them is sort of like openly interested in men, and the other one is very not, and they're very close friends, And then one of them joins the war because he has like a German mom, and there are people, they're worried about his sister's prospects in marriage if her brother is seen as a sort of defector. And so then the other one joins the army, and it's their like them navigating and it's illegal in Britain at the time to like sodomy, homosexuality, all these things. And so it's them navigating their relationship with each other, and also war and the trauma of war. And there's these like really horrible scenes of like the trenches, and then they both get like pretty gravely injured, and it's just like really, I don't normally like war books, and I loved this one so much. I mean, it helps that it's pretty gay, like a lot of cute sex scenes and stuff like that, but like I just read it before we started rereading for the podcast, and so the little text boxes with the like visceral stuff, but the juxtaposition of the kidding around and then like the blowing up, right? That book just was really called to mind, and it was a great read. I recommend. I think it's a debut novel. The author's Alice Wynne, and it's like incredibly well researched. And the conceit, the kind of gimmick is that their boys' school has a paper section that always has it in memoriam, and so they're the boys keep graduating and enlisting, and so they're checking the in memoriams, and they're talking constantly about what would be written in mine, right? If I were to die in war, what would they say about me? It's just like really beautiful. And then my one little thing that's, I guess, both a little bit theory. I don't think it counts as millennial comedy because this is very specific to like feminist political theory. Right. But I was thinking about in the section in particular, I think on page 17.
Ooh, I think 16.
16.
I think yes. This is a great transition. Yes.
Yeah, where they're talking about the mundanity, right, and the comparison of the movies about waitressing and movies about soldiers. So like they're making a movie about waitressing. Waitresses go and watch it and see all these sexy characters meeting dashing, dangerous men, and every encounter is some bullshit verbal joust. Like fuck no, you serve old fucking fat people shit food for 10 hours. Some tiff you, some sip you, blah blah blah. Iraq was mundane. I was thinking in this passage about, and this is not quite what Wollstonecraft is arguing, but the part in Vindication of the Rights of Women where she compares women to soldiers, and where she talks about how women are not allowed to, like, one of the facets of their sort of oppression is that they're not allowed to develop reason and to develop virtue, right? Or in other words, they're not given the opportunity to develop themselves in accordance with their own like reason and thus become virtuous people. So virtue for her is not necessarily like a preordained outcome of ascribing to a certain set of values. It's the process of cultivating oneself. And she says that both women and that women are deprived of that in part through the way that soldiers are, right? That they're not allowed to ask questions. They're expected to adhere to a set of rules that they have had no hand in shaping, and that are like put beyond what's like available to interrogate. And I thought this was really interesting, like to make a parallel between like a sort of paradigmatic thing that women do and a feature of soldiers' lives. Like what an interesting, I don't know, like analogy to use, and that also has a history, right, that dates all the way back to 18th century England. So I was just like, okay, Wollstonecraft's still relevant here.
Yeah, that's incredible. I love that so much. All of those are great. That novel sounds really, really excellent.
I think you'd really like it. It's very good. Yeah.
I also am remembering, this is, my own memories coming back to me. I'm pretty sure that like Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything like gets name checked and is a little bit of like a talismanic figure in the book.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
If I'm remembering correctly. Mm-hmm. So we can keep that for that cultural artifact.
All right. Take us into our comedy section.
Okay. I mean, there's so much dark humor in this. I'm going to start off with a Shane humor, right? So this is Shane describing Murdock very early on in the chapter, page 16. Mm-hmm. Quote, bomb tech peace activist, part autodidact, part swinging dick male trope. Mm-hmm. Though she'd mostly been dating women at the time, she told him, quote, I doubt you could have activated my fourth wave feminist impulses more completely, end quote, which is like so good. Perfect, like, jab at like masculinity generally, Murdock's masculinity specifically. And then my fourth wave feminist impulses were to sleep with that guy. Yeah. Like, it's just hilarious.
It's so good. I loved that so much. I literally literally wrote LOL in the margins. It's like, yeah, incredible stuff. Yeah, I also, man, just so much of this was like really, really dark to me. There's a couple things on page 18 that are just like some turns of phrase that were pretty funny. I thought it was very funny that he describes himself as a sort of cerebral hick. He talks about, and when he's explaining EOD school, he goes, Murdock was more like a savant who'd gotten a lot of mechanical training by accident working in his mom's boyfriend's auto shop since he was 10. Some guys can just tell how the lock balls and gears of a setback armed, mechanically timed Gray's impact fired mortar fuse are gonna work. And gonna in the like Gonna, that sentence absolutely killed me. It was just like that whole box was just the shift in language and this idea that the lock balls and gears are just, like innate. It's very, very funny to me. And like that follows directly on the heels of this like fourth wave feminist like critiquing his masculinity thing. I think he does perspective so well in this chapter for sure. I mean,
brilliant.
We're
really,
gonna say
really
some
wonderful
stuff, I'm sure, in the next one, but
for sure.
Yeah.
I also think, and this is the part where it's like, I'm personally offended by this extremely relatable content, is Shane describing why you can't make a film about the Iraq War good. And I'm like, shit, I could have said this. And I don't love that I see myself here.
Yeah.
You know why there will never be a great movie or great art about the Iraq War? She asked, why is that? This fucking sentence, Emily. Quote, because it hewed too didactically to its own absurdity, end quote. Just like that fucking sent me.
I think I've said that before also. And
there's no doubt.
I literally like hung my head in shame when I read that sentence. I was like, oh no. Oh no.
This is not the first time we're going to be deeply seen and uncomfortable.
How can you make subtle contemplative art about that? The whole thing was an unknowing satire of itself. Like, yeah. That is another thing that I do when I'm analyzing anything is like, I'm always trying to make things into satire. I'm like, it's good because it's satire. And everyone's like, no, this is meant to be taken at face value. So also felt seen on that one. Oh, there's one more. Which page is this on? I think this is also on page 18. No. When he jokes about, bottom of 18, Shane says, did you keep up with anyone from the Iraq Veterans Against War? And he said, nah, didn't see the point. War's over. Might as well be the Spanish American imbroglio as far as anyone remembers or gives a fuck. He pronounces the word with a hard G. Imbroglio. I was just like, I loved that. First of all, that he makes that joke, right? This joke is that like, nobody fucking cares about that war. I'm not even going to call it a war. And then
but it's so key and core to your Origi point as well. So it works on multiple.
Yes. But and then the joke on his behalf, right? That he doesn't even know how to pronounce the word that he used. That really got me.
There's so much. I mean, like the Professor Whitehall, like when he first encounters Murdock and is like, find a therapist, like to go cry to them and then come to me when you want to get real or whatever. And then like the darkest humor in part because of like what happens to him is Murdock's captain, right? Troy Teamu, right? So like thinking about page 27, like his quote unquote performance review he gives to Manfuck Murdock as he's like walking about to defuse a bomb. Or, the like jokes he makes with his kids and Murdock coming to visit them once they all get back.
Yeah.
Right. Tamu replied that he'd have no white shit demon from the sticks in his house. And the kids screamed with laughter and his wife reprimanded him for cursing, and Murdock had to get up and leave, at which point he began to cry violently until Tamu found out the entrance to the house and told him to stop being a pussy. Of course, Manfuck had come visit LA.
They grill steaks.
Yeah.
Right.
And like so much of the writing of Tamu is like this deeply emotional character, but also like the darkest of the dark humor coming from him.
Yeah.
And then Murdock takes that on, like it's like when Tamu dies, like that gets passed on, like the mantle of the darkest humor. I'm thinking about like the jokes that he makes about like having like elements of Tamu stuck in his like teeth and his eyes. And
he has to like literally, remove parts of his friend from his own self. Yeah, I think it's a good segue to our solidarity, allies, and enemies section too. Unless we have another funny. Yeah. So aside from Kellen Murdock and Shane, what's the name she's going by right now?
Shane Acosta.
Tamu's the biggest, I think, other figure kind of looming here, and I believe he's like a recurring figure in a way. No. I'm
trying to decide how much cryptic foreshadowing to do. I think like
yes and no.
Yes and no, and like Murdock's relationship to memory is an ongoing question of the novel.
Right.
Maybe we can say that.
And you don't know right at the outset of the chapter that he's dead, right? You sort of figure that out through the text boxes. And one of the biggest ones is the scene where he dies, right? It's just one of those things where they're just on a normal day, they defuse what they think is a bomb, which ends up being a decoy, and the other one explodes, and then suddenly they're under fire. So he's talking about this in the like reaction section, right? It's like my friend is like literally pieces of him are in between my teeth, and I just go into like reflex mode.
Which is a bit of a parallel to Gale, right? From the Tony chapter, right? This signal figure and their exact status at the beginning of the chapter is unclear. They're core to defining the main character's like sense of themselves in the world and what they do in the world. And both of them die with that information communicated to us, the reader, in like this questionable temporality.
Well, yikes that they're both people of color.
And people of color.
But I think at least for Murdock, that is an important point, right? Because he's also thinking about what it means to be American. And he's like, what is the American Samoa, right? Like, and it's a part of his own education, right? Like Tony ostensibly had to take a class where he learned the word intersectionality or something, right? Like at least once. And like not the case for Murdock, but until after. Maybe that's questionable, but
and that he names American Samoa is no longer a place where Frodo goes in Lord of the Rings, which was he says was his first thought, to like outposts of the American military state.
Right.
The exact phrase. Like the Northern Marianas, Guam, like these other kind of.
Who else?
Yeah, Kieran Slade, who Murdock mentions a couple of times, is like, other than Troy Ta'amu, his kind of closest like brother in Iraq or whatever. But because of Murdock's activism in Iva, he and Slade were no longer in touch.
And then Alan Ford is Shane's mentor and comrade, and that's kind of all we get about him here, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. More on Alan to come, I think we can say.
One character plotting mapping question I have for you. Do you think, so we talked a little bit last time about how we think Tony is being portrayed in a light that's maybe not super sympathetic. Just from this initial chapter, do we think we're supposed to feel more sympathy toward either Shane or Murdock, or are we encountering them with sort of neutral sympathy?
I think we're supposed to be extremely sympathetic towards Murdock. Like I think we're at least set up to possibly be sympathetic towards him. And Shane is more of a cipher, somewhat perhaps on point with like the questions we asked about like how this is a little bit of a pretend or a game for her, but then also with like the mysterious nature of what it is she's recruiting Murdock for. Like I think that the like lack of decidability about Shane as a character actually matches the plot. Helpful is
beautiful. I think so too. Think so too. Okay, should we? I feel like we're putting off the part we don't want to do.
We sure are.
Do you want to go first?
Oh, sure. I guess I don't love this, and I expect we'll be choosing yours. But my episode title, I took the political slogan or call to action quite expansively, and would propose incitement to a different kind of war is like the like title of like a pamphlet, like a political pamphlet. That also fits this chapter.
That's very funny. So I was thinking of it as like following the colon. So the chapter title is Shane and Murdock Get Breakfast. So I was thinking Shane and Murdock, and then like the one that I thought of that's most like yours is Only One War is Just. But like we don't know which one that is really. It's just like that's the I think the hint, what it's hinting toward. I also thought this is like a bit of a kind of internal wink, and I don't remember yet what the significance of this is, but we could also use Build the Path.
I think we use Build the Path.
Really?
Yes,
so this
absolutely.
is like Shane's tattoo that he notices, it doesn't remember what it is, and he assumes it's some like liberal mumbo jumbo. But I think we're supposed to think it's something more significant than that.
I think that your thinking is correct, and we should say no more and just name the episode that. Yeah.
Build the Path.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Fine. I accept.
Beautiful. I think you did better than you thought you did. Me, not so sure, but you did better than
we had the same idea.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to this episode on Shane. Coming up next, we have our first chapter with Jackie entitled The Actor, and it is set in 2014, which we will be doing in the style of a pitch deck.
Yes, which Emily and I know a lot about and do all the time,
Question
and have
mark,
no
question mark, question mark.
have no speaking of satire, no digs that we will make at the form of the pitch deck.
Or it will be exclusively digs. Great. Anything else?
No, thank you for listening to this episode of We Are the Deluge.
And we are the Deluge.
Yes.